My father-in-law and I did that when he caught me touching mine. Imagine being caught in a moment so intimate and dangerous that it threatens to unravel everything you've built. What happens when forbidden feelings surface, crossing lines that should never be crossed? This is a story of secrets, guilt, and passion, a story that asks, how far would you go to feel seen? Before we dive into this gripping tale, make sure to subscribe to my channel for more compelling stories like this, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. It happened on a quiet evening, the kind that begged for normalcy, but instead unraveled my entire life. My hand lingered on the fabric of my dress, smoothing it absently, while my father-in-law, Richard, stood frozen in the doorway. His piercing eyes locked onto mine, a mixture of shock and something I couldn't quite name reflected back at me. I felt the blood drain from my face, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. The room seemed to shrink around us, the air so thick it was hard to breathe. "Emma," he said finally, his voice deep and steady but with an undertone of something electric. "What are you doing?" I wanted to speak. I wanted to laugh it off, to pretend like the moment hadn't just stolen the last shred of my innocence, but my mouth refused to form words. The truth was, I didn't even know what I was doing. My hand had drifted aimlessly over my thigh, an unconscious gesture as I sat curled up on the sofa. The soft glow of the fireplace cast shadows across the room, making everything feel surreal. He took a step inside, letting the door click softly shut behind him. I straightened instinctively, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks as his gaze flickered downward, just briefly before returning to meet my eyes. "I didn't mean to intrude," he continued, his tone gentler now, as though trying to undo the tension that had just materialized between us. "I thought you'd gone to bed." "No," I managed to whisper, my voice hoarse and unfamiliar. "I was just sitting here." "Then what ought we?" Richard stepped further into the room, his footsteps muffled by the thick rug. "It's late," he said, his voice softer now. "You should get some rest." I nodded, a futile attempt to assert some semblance of normalcy. But I couldn't bring myself to stand. My legs felt like lead, my body refusing to obey the command to leave. Instead, I stayed rooted to the spot, watching as he lingered a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly. "You seem upset." "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. But Richard didn't look convinced. He moved to the chair across from me, lowering himself with the kind of quiet grace that only deepened the knot in my stomach. "You know," he said, leaning forward slightly, "I'm here if you need to talk. About anything." The sincerity in his voice was disarming, and for a moment, I considered spilling everything. The loneliness, the resentment, the way Jake's absence had hollowed out my heart. But how could I? How could I admit to Richard, of all people, the cracks in the life I'd worked so hard to build? "I appreciate that," I said instead, my voice trembling just enough to betray me. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged, until finally Richard exhaled and leaned back in his chair. "Jake doesn't deserve you, you know." The words hit me like a freight train, raw and unfiltered. My breath caught, and I stared at him, my heart thundering in my chest. "What?" "You're an incredible woman, Emma," he said simply, his eyes never leaving mine. "And I worry that he doesn't see that." The room spun, his words leaving me both flattered and disoriented. I wanted to respond, to say something, anything, but my thoughts were a tangled mess. In that moment, Richard stood and crossed the room, pausing beside me. His hand brushed my shoulder briefly, a touch so fleeting yet so charged that it left my skin burning. "Good night, Emma," he said softly before retreating toward the door. But before he left, he turned back, his eyes lingering on me for just a heartbeat too long. "If you need anything at all, don't hesitate." And then he was gone, leaving me alone with the echo of his words and the dangerous flutter in my chest, as I hadn't felt in years. By the time the afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen window, warming the space but leaving me cold, I found myself anticipating his arrival like an unspoken promise I didn't fully understand. It was just past 4 when the sound of the front door opening jolted me out of my reverie. I straightened instinctively, smoothing my hair as Richard stepped inside, carrying a paper bag in one hand and a warm, easy smile. "Emma," he greeted, setting the bag on the counter. "I figured you might not have had lunch, so I brought something." "Oh," I stammered, caught off guard. "That's really thoughtful. Thank you." He waved it off, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment before he began unpacking the bag. The smell of freshly baked bread and roasted vegetables wafted through the air, making my stomach rumble. I hadn't realized how little I'd eaten. "You didn't have to do this," I said softly, leaning against the counter as he arranged plates. There was something oddly intimate about the act, so different from Jake's hurried, impersonal habits. "But it's appreciated." "Hmm?" Richard shrugged, his movements deliberate as he set 2 plates on the table. "I know how it is," he replied. "Sometimes you just need someone to look out for you." His words struck a chord, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. We sat together, the food a pleasant distraction from the tension that still hummed in the air. Conversation came easily, surprisingly so, as we talked about mundane things, the weather, the garden, a book he'd been reading. But beneath the surface, I could feel the same crackling energy from the night before, unspoken yet undeniable. As we finished eating, Richard leaned back in his chair, studying me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "You don't seem happy, Emma," he said bluntly, his voice low but steady. The question caught me off guard, and I froze, my fork hovering midair. "What do you mean?" I hedged, though I knew exactly what he meant. "You don't have to say it," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "I see it. The way you look when Jake isn't here, the way you seem to carry everything on your own." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "It's not that simple," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Jake works hard. He provides for us." Richard raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. "And what about you? What's he providing for you, Emma? Because from where I'm sitting, it doesn't look like much." I stared at him, my chest tight with a mix of defensiveness and longing. I wanted to argue, to defend Jake, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I looked down at my hands, twisting them in my lap. "It's complicated," I admitted finally, my voice breaking. Richard's expression softened, and he reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. "It doesn't have to be," he said quietly. "You deserve more than this." His touch sent a shiver through me, and for a moment I couldn't move. The sincerity in his voice was overwhelming, and I felt the tears welling in my eyes. "I don't know what I deserve anymore," I confessed, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. You deserve to be happy, he said firmly, his hand still resting on mine. And if Jake can't give you that... The sentence hung in the air, unfinished, but heavy with implication. I pulled my hand back, the gesture more reflex than intention, and stood abruptly, needing space to breathe. I should clean up, I mumbled, gathering the plates and heading to the sink. I gathered them and handed them. Richard didn't follow, but I could feel his eyes on me as I scrubbed at the dishes with more force than necessary. The silence stretched, thick and unyielding, until he finally stood and moved toward the door. Emma, he said softly, pausing in the doorway, you don't have to do this alone. I didn't turn around, didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I listened to the sound of his footsteps retreating down the hall, the click of the front door as it closed behind him. Only then did I let the tears fall, hot and silent, as I leaned against the sink, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Mind if I join you? He asked, holding up a small basket of tools. I hesitated, but only for a moment. Of course, I said, forcing a smile. I could use the help. We worked side by side, the rhythm of digging and planting grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. But even as we chatted about flowers and soil, the tension between us remained, simmering just beneath the surface. It wasn't until we'd finished and were sitting on the porch sipping iced tea that the conversation turned heavier. At the end, you've been on my mind, Richard admitted, his voice low and steady. I looked at him sharply, my heart skipping a beat. Richard? I know, he said quickly, holding up a hand. I know how it sounds, and I don't want to make things harder for you. But I can't ignore what I see, Emma. I can't pretend I don't care. The vulnerability in his voice was staggering, and for a moment I couldn't find the words. When I finally spoke, my voice was barely a whisper. This, whatever this is, it can't happen. I know, he said again, his eyes searching mine, but that doesn't change the fact that it already has. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. From what? I asked, my voice trembling. There's nothing to run away from. Don't lie to me, he said gently, standing and closing the gap between us. Or to yourself. I took a step back, bumping into the porch railing as his words pierced through me. Richard, this is wrong, I whispered, shaking my head. You're my father-in-law, Jake's father. We can't... I know it's wrong, he interrupted, his expression pained. Do you think I haven't told myself that every single time I look at you? But it doesn't change how I feel. His admission hit me like a tidal wave, overwhelming and terrifying. You can't say that, I said, my voice breaking. You can't feel that. But I do, he said simply, his gaze unwavering. And I think you do too. My breath caught, and I looked away, unable to face the truth in his eyes. He was right, of course. I hated him for it. Hated myself for the way my heart fluttered when he was near, the way my skin burned at the memory of his touch. But admitting it would shatter whatever fragile line I was clinging to. I need to go inside, I said finally, my voice barely audible. He didn't try to stop me, but as I turned to leave, his voice followed me. You're not alone, Emma. You don't have to carry this by yourself. Jake, oblivious as ever, was home briefly before leaving again for another work trip. His departure left a gaping void that I tried desperately to fill, but every corner of the house seemed to echo with memories of Richard, the way he had looked at me, the things he had said. It all replayed in an endless loop, stirring emotions I didn't want to name. It was late one evening when everything came to a head. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after a solitary dinner when the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat as I approached the door, already knowing who it would be. Richard stood on the porch, his expression unreadable. He held a bottle of wine in one hand and a tentative smile in the other. "I thought you might like some company," he said, his voice quiet but steady. I hesitated, my fingers gripping the edge of the door. "Richard, I don't think this is a good idea." "Please, Emma," he said, his eyes searching mine. "Just for a little while. I'll leave if you want me to, but I couldn't stay away." His honesty disarmed me, and before I could stop myself, I stepped aside, allowing him in. He set the bottle on the counter and busied himself opening it, his movements careful and deliberate. The silence between us was thick with tension, but there was an unspoken understanding in the way we moved around each other. We sat in the living room, the wine an unspoken truce between us. Conversation started cautiously, touching on safe topics like work and family. But it didn't take long for the cracks to show. "Why are you really here?" I asked finally, setting my glass down and meeting his gaze. "What do you want from me?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening as he searched for the right words. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw. "I just know that I care about you more than I should. And I think you care about me too." He stopped then. The room seemed to tilt, the weight of his words pulling me under. "Richard, this isn't fair," I said, my voice trembling. "To Jake, to us, to anyone. We can't do this." "I know," he said, his expression pained. "But what am I supposed to do, Emma? Pretend I don't feel what I feel? Pretend I don't see the way you look at me?" I started to deny it, but the words caught in my throat. He was too close now, his presence overwhelming. "This is wrong," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "Maybe it is," he said softly, his hand reaching out to brush against mine. "But I don't think either of us can walk away from it." The touch sent a jolt through me, and before I could think, I pulled my hand back. "You should go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Please, Richard, just go." He hesitated, his eyes lingering on me as though he wanted to say something more. But finally he stood, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I never wanted to hurt you." And then he was gone, leaving me alone with the unbearable weight of what could never be. The days after Richard's departure were a whirlwind of suppressed emotions and constant self-reproach. I tried to convince myself that what had happened, or almost happened, was a fleeting moment of weakness, an emotional lapse born of loneliness. But no matter how many times I replayed it in my head, I couldn't erase the intensity of his words, or the way his touch had sent electricity through my entire body. Jake's return home only deepened my turmoil. He was his usual detached self, dropping his bag by the door and scrolling through his phone as I greeted him. "Hey," he said absent-mindedly, brushing a quick kiss across my cheek before retreating into the living room. "How was the trip?" I asked, hoping to mask my unease with forced normalcy. "Same old," he replied, not looking up. "A lot of meetings, late nights. You know how it is." I nodded, biting back the retort that rose to my lips. No, I didn't know how it was. I didn't know what it was like to prioritize work over everything else, to treat marriage as an obligation instead of a partnership. But what right did I have to judge him when my own heart was far from innocent? Dinner that night was a strained affair, the silence between us more telling than any conversation could have been. I found myself studying Jake, searching for the man I'd fallen in love with years ago. but all I saw was someone who had drifted so far from me that I wasn't sure how to bridge the gap. A week later, Richard showed up unannounced. I was in the garden, pruning the roses that had grown wild, when his voice startled me. "Those look beautiful." I turned sharply, my breath catching as I saw him standing by the gate. He looked different, tired, perhaps, or burdened by the same weight that had been pressing down on me. "Richard," I said, my voice guarded, "what are you doing here?" "I wanted to see how you were," he replied, stepping closer. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you, Emma." My heart raced, but I kept my expression neutral. "You shouldn't have come." "I know," he admitted, his gaze steady. But I couldn't stay away. I set down the shears, wiping my hands on my jeans. "This has to stop," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. "Whatever this is, it can't happen. I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly, his tone earnest. "I just needed to see you, to make sure you're okay." The vulnerability in his voice undid me, and I looked away, unable to hold his gaze. "I'm fine," I said, though the words felt like a lie. "You should go before Jake gets home." Richard didn't move. "Emma, I know this is hard for you. It's hard for me too. But pretending it isn't there won't make it go away." I turned back to him, anger flaring despite myself. "What do you want me to say, Richard? That I feel it too? That I can't stop thinking about you? What good does that do?" "It means we're not alone," he said simply. I stared at him, my chest tight with a mix of frustration and longing. "Being alone would be easier," I said bitterly. "At least then I wouldn't feel like I'm betraying everyone around me." "You're not betraying anyone by feeling something," he said gently. "You can't control that." "But I can control what I do," I shot back, my voice rising. "And what I'm doing right now is wrong." Richard's expression softened, and he stepped closer, his hand reaching out but stopping just short of touching me. "I would never ask you to do anything you didn't want to do," he said quietly. "But I can't pretend I don't care about you, Emma. Not anymore." I closed my eyes, fighting back tears. "You need to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Please, Richard." For a moment, he didn't move. Then he nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly as he turned to go. "Take care of yourself, Emma," he said softly, before walking away. That evening, Jake came home early, his face clouded with frustration. "What's wrong?" I asked, as he tossed his keys on the counter. "Work's a mess," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I might have to leave again next week." I nodded, the weight of his words settling heavily on me. "Do you ever think about us, Jake?" I asked suddenly, surprising even myself. He looked at me, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you ever think about what we used to be, before work took over everything?" Jake sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Emma, I'm doing this for us, for our future." "But what about the present?" I pressed, my voice trembling. "What about right now?" His silence was answer enough, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "You're not the only one who's lonely, Jake," I said quietly, before turning and walking out of the room. The next few days passed in a blur of strained interactions and mounting tension. Richard didn't come by, and I told myself it was for the best. But late at night, when the house was quiet and Jake was asleep, I found myself replaying every word, every glance, every touch. The longing was unbearable, a gnawing ache that refused to be ignored. It wasn't until the weekend that everything came to a head. Jake had left for another trip, and I was alone in the house when Richard appeared at the door, his expression resolute. "We need to talk," he said simply. I let him in, my heart pounding as I closed the door behind him. "Richard, this has to stop," I began, but he held up a hand. "I know," he said, his voice firm, "but before it does, I need to tell you something." I braced myself, unsure of what was coming. "What is it?" He stepped closer, his gaze locking onto mine. "I love you, Emma. I know it's wrong, and I know it complicates everything, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way." The words hit me like a thunderclap, and I felt my knees weaken. "Richard, I don't expect anything from you," he said quickly, his voice breaking. "I just needed you to know." Tears streamed down my face as I stared at him, my heart breaking under the weight of his confession. "I can't do this," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I can't." "Let me help you leave." "I know," he said softly, his own eyes glistening. "But I had to tell you." The silence between us was deafening, the air thick with unspoken emotions. And then, without thinking, I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. For a moment, everything else faded away as his arms enveloped me, his warmth grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. But even as I clung to him, I knew this was the beginning of the end. The fragile line we had walked for so long had finally shattered, and there was no going back. The embrace didn't last long, but its impact lingered in the air between us. When we finally pulled apart, I couldn't look at him. The weight of what had just happened, what was still happening, pressed heavily on my chest. Richard stood there, his hand brushing against mine as if to comfort me. But I stepped back, needing space to think, to breathe. "I shouldn't have done that," I murmured, wrapping my arms around myself. It's too much." "Emma," he said softly, his voice filled with concern, "you don't have to carry this alone. You've been holding everything in for so long, but you're human. You deserve to feel." "Not like this," I interrupted, my voice louder than I intended. "Not with you. Do you know what this would do to Jake? To us?" His face tightened, and he ran a hand through his hair, the silver streaks catching the dim light. "I know," he admitted, his voice heavy. His honesty made my chest ache, and tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered, shaking my head. "It's not fair to anyone." He nodded slowly, his jaw clenching as if he were holding back his own emotions. "You're right," he said finally. "But that doesn't make it any easier." The silence between us was deafening, and I felt the tears spill over, streaking down my cheeks. Richard reached out, his hand brushing against my arm, but I pulled away, shaking my head. "Please, just go," I said, my voice barely audible. For a moment he hesitated, his eyes searching mine as if he wanted to say more. But then he nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly as he turned toward the door. "If that's what you want," he said, quietly. His voice filled with resignation. As he left, the door clicking shut behind him, I collapsed onto the sofa, my body racked with silent sobs. I didn't know how to reconcile the storm of emotions swirling inside me. The guilt, the longing, the heartbreak. All I knew was that something had shifted between us, and there was no going back. In the days that followed, I threw myself into anything that would distract me. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, baked enough to fill a small bakery, and even started repainting the guest room. But no matter how hard I tried, my thoughts always drifted back to Richard. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the way he'd looked at me, the way he'd held me, as if I were the only thing grounding him. Jake came home briefly between trips, his presence a reminder of the life I was supposed to be living. I'd tried to act normal, but the distance between us was palpable. He seemed content to ignore it, burying himself in work and brushing off my attempts at conversation. It only deepened the hollow ache inside me. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen and froze when I saw Richard's name. My heart raced as I debated whether to answer, but before I could decide, the buzzing stopped, and a voicemail icon appeared. With trembling hands, I pressed play, his voice filling the quiet room. "Emma, I know I shouldn't be calling, but I had to hear your voice. I don't want to make things harder for you, but I miss you more than I should. If you need anything at all, you know where to find me." I stared at the phone long after the message ended, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I knew I shouldn't call him back. I knew I should delete the message and pretend it never happened. But a part of me, a part I hated to acknowledge, wanted to hear his voice again. The next day, I found myself standing on Richard's porch, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. I had no plan, no idea what I was going to say. All I knew was that I couldn't ignore this any longer. When he opened the door, his eyes widened in surprise. "Emma," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice shaky. I needed to talk to you." He stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. The living room was warm and inviting, but I couldn't bring myself to sit. I stood in the center of the room, wringing my hands as he closed the door behind me. "I got your message," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, "and I can't stop thinking about what you said." Richard's expression softened, and he stepped closer, his movements careful as if he were afraid I might bolt. "Emma, I never meant to complicate your life," he said gently, "but I can't pretend I don't feel this way. As soon as I saw your nose, tears welled in my eyes, and I shook my head. I don't know what to do, Richard. I'm so confused." He reached out, his hand brushing against my cheek as he looked into my eyes. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said softly. "Just know that I'm here for you, whatever you need." The sincerity in his voice broke something inside me, and I felt the tears spill over. "This is so wrong," I whispered, but even as I said it, I didn't pull away. "I know," he said, his own voice cracking. "But it doesn't change how I feel." The space between us seemed to shrink, and before I could think, I leaned into him, my head resting against his chest. His arms wrapped around me, and for the first time in months, I felt safe. I knew it couldn't last, knew the moment would end, but for now, I let myself stay in the comfort of his embrace. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of clarity that felt almost foreign. The events of the previous day had unraveled everything I'd been trying to keep hidden. Sitting in Richard's arms had been both a sanctuary and a revelation, but the comfort it brought only made the inevitable fallout more daunting. I couldn't keep pretending. Something had to give. As I moved into the room, Jake's return home that afternoon came earlier than expected. I heard his car pull into the driveway as I stood in the kitchen, the smell of coffee lingering in the air. My heart tightened, knowing I'd have to face him, with the weight of my secrets still fresh in my chest. He walked in, looking tired but distracted, as always. "Hey," he said, dropping his bag by the door and heading to the fridge for a drink. "You okay? You look off." I forced a smile. "I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." Jake nodded, sipping his drink, as if my answer was good enough. The disconnect between us had grown so vast that even his concern felt perfunctory, a habit more than genuine care. I watched him for a moment, trying to remember what it had felt like when we were close, when we shared more than just space. "Jake?" I said hesitantly, my voice catching his attention. "Yeah," he replied, glancing up from his phone. "Do you ever feel like we've lost something?" I asked, my heart pounding. He frowned, setting his phone down. "What do you mean?" "I mean us," I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay composed. "Do you ever feel like we're just going through the motions?" Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Emma, if this is about work—" "It's not just about work," I interrupted, my voice firmer now. "It's about everything. I feel like we're strangers living in the same house." He looked at me, his brow furrowing. "I'm doing everything I can to provide for us. Isn't that enough?" "Providing isn't the same as being present," I said, my voice cracking. "I need more than that, Jake. I need you." The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment I thought he might finally say something meaningful, but instead he sighed again and shook his head. "Emma, I don't know what you want from me." His words hit me like a slap, and I felt my composure slipping. "I want a husband who sees me," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "Who cares about me, who wants to be with me." "Is that too much to ask?" "Hush." Jake opened his mouth as if to respond, but then closed it, his expression unreadable. "I need to take a walk," he said finally, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. I stood there, watching him leave, the sound of the door slamming echoing through the house. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable, and I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. The weight of everything, Jake's indifference, my connection with Richard, the lies I was living, threatened to crush me. That evening, Richard called. I hesitated before answering, my thumb hovering over the screen. But when his name disappeared and the voicemail icon appeared, I knew I couldn't avoid him forever. I played the message, his voice low and steady despite the tension I could sense beneath it. "Emma, I don't want to push you, but I need to know if you're okay. If you need anything, I'm here." I listened to the message twice before I finally called him back. The phone rang only once before he answered. "Emma," he said, his voice soft and relieved. "I'm glad you called." "I don't know why I did," I admitted, my voice trembling. I didn't want to feel alone." "You're not alone," he said firmly. "You never are." His words wrapped around me like a balm, and I felt a surge of emotion I couldn't contain. "Richard, I don't know what to do," I confessed. "I feel like everything is falling apart." "Then let me help you," he said gently. "You don't have to do this by yourself." I closed my eyes, the tears spilling over once again. "It's not that simple." "I know," he said, "but nothing worth having ever is." The sincerity in his voice broke something inside me, and I found myself whispering the words I'd been too afraid to say out loud. I can't stop thinking about you. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, but when Richard spoke again, his voice was filled with quiet resolve. Then don't. The next time I saw Richard, it was under the pretense of returning something he'd left at the house, a set of tools he'd lent us months ago. Jake was still out, and I told myself it was a harmless visit, nothing more. But the moment I stepped inside his house, the tension between us was undeniable. "Emma," he said, his voice soft as he took the tools from my hands. "You didn't have to come all this way." "I wanted to," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I needed to see you." His eyes searched mine, and for a moment the world seemed to stand still. Then, as if drawn by a force neither of us could resist, he stepped closer, his hand brushing against my cheek. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice trembling. "If this isn't what you want, tell me and I'll stop." He pressed another kiss, as if seeking consent, better than I couldn't speak. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. All I could do was close the remaining distance between us, my hands tangling in his shirt as his lips met mine. The kiss was desperate and tender, filled with years of longing and regret, and I felt myself breaking and mending all at once. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, and his breath came in shallow gasps. "Emma," he whispered, his voice raw. "What are we doing?" "I don't know," I admitted, tears streaming down my face. "But I can't let go." Neither of us spoke as we stood there, clinging to each other, as if the world outside didn't exist. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt seen, felt wanted. And though I knew the path ahead would be filled with pain and uncertainty, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. The days that followed were a whirlwind of secrecy and stolen moments. Each glance, each accidental brush of hands when Richard and I were near, carried a weight that seemed to deepen the invisible bond between us. But with every touch came the inescapable shadow of guilt. It all came crashing down one fateful evening. Jake had returned home early, his mood somber and withdrawn. I didn't question it at first, assuming it was just work weighing on him again. But when Richard stopped by unexpectedly, his presence sending my pulse racing, I noticed the way Jake's demeanor shifted. He was watching, closer than ever. Richard greeted us both, his calm mask firmly in place. He'd come under the guise of dropping off something Jake had asked for weeks ago, but I could feel the tension in the air, sharp and unrelenting. As Jake poured himself a drink, his movements slow and deliberate, he finally spoke. "Whoa, you two seem close," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. The glass I was holding slipped from my hand, shattering on the tile floor. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as Richard's jaw tightened. "Jake, I don't know what you mean," he said evenly. "Oh, I think you do," Jake replied, his voice low but dangerous. "I've seen the way you look at her, and the way she looks at you." My heart raced, panic surging through me. "Jake, you're imagining things," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "Am I?" he said, his eyes locking on to mine. "Because it doesn't feel like it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Don't," Jake snapped, his gaze shifting to Richard. "Don't insult me by pretending." Richard glanced at me, his expression torn. Jake, I care about Emma, but it's not what you think. It's exactly what I think, Jake said bitterly, his hands clenching into fists. You can have her, because clearly I never really had her in the first place. I thrashed the nearby bed. The words cut deeper than I expected, and before I could respond, Jake stormed out of the house, leaving the doors swinging open in his wake. The sound of his car engine roaring to life and fading into the distance left a deafening silence behind. I collapsed onto the couch, my body shaking with sobs as Richard knelt beside me, his hand resting gently on my back. I'm so sorry, Emma, he whispered, his voice filled with anguish. This isn't how I wanted things to happen. I turned to him, tears streaming down my face. We've destroyed everything. He wrapped his arms around me, his embrace both a comfort and a reminder of the choices we'd made. We'll figure this out, he said softly. Together. But as I sat there in the wreckage of my life, I couldn't help but wonder if some things were too broken to ever be repaired.